When I first applied for the stage in, I think it was 75, I sent in my application. I thought, well, I don't have bad qualifications. I had a first from LSE, sporting chance. Never heard another dicky bird. And then there was a drinks party. I was working for the Independent Broadcasting Authority. And someone came, whose name I forget, and she said, well, what did you do to follow up? Who did you speak to? Who did you lobby? I thought, what? I'm a Brit. I don't go around lobbying to get through the first stage of an application. Anyway, I wised up. So the second application I put in and learned that if you, they send a blue book round the commission of people, I believe the cut-off is a 2-1, and then you need someone to pick you off the blue book. And I spoke to a chap called Leslie Fielding, some of you remember, was in DG1, External Relations, and I didn't know him. He'd come and spoken at LSE, but I clearly remember him ringing me up on a weekday morning, 9 o'clock his time, 8 o'clock mine, and we had a brief chat. I presume he satisfied himself I wasn't a complete idiot. And lo and behold, I got an offer to do the stage in DG1 on textile negotiations, and there's quite a few alumni of the textile negotiations in 77, 8 in this room. So that was my experience. And then when I passed the concours, and I was on the reserve list, and I contacted UCREP, UK representation in Brussels, not interested at all in trying to get any Brits into the commission. 6 months later, they came back to me. There'd been a change of management. I can't now remember who, to be honest. So there was some help. Unfortunately, I ended up working for Henri Etienne in the Secretariat General. He's a bit of a patriarchal Luxembourger. He'd never had an A-grade woman working for him, and he didn't like Brits. So, guess what? He got me. I think he didn't want to lose me because we had a fierce row when I stuck it for 2 years and then I wanted to transfer. He accused me of disloyalty. And I have to say, not particularly from him, it was more sort of general sexism from him, but I had 2 experiences of very explicit sexism in the commission, which I've never had before or since. One, I was sent to be interviewed by the head of the anti-dumping unit, who, as I walked into the room, said, don't bother to sit down. I'm just for form's sake, since DG personnel have sent you, I have to kind of let you in the room, but I will never recruit a woman because you'd lead my male officials astray on missions abroad. And nice compliment, maybe. And then in my director in DG4 competition, when I was expecting promotion, told me he had to promote a colleague who'd actually transferred in from the council secretariat, even though I had more seniority. But the reason that this chap had to go first was, A, he was older than me, but B, he was père de famille. He was the father of a family. I had just recently got married, and I think that, I obviously was not the father of a family. That, as far as I know, is not one of the criteria for promotion. But I hope and believe that it's a lot better now. But I think I did get the sharp end. Anyway, let's move on to the European Parliament. I finally got there in '99, being a Lib Dem. It took me 15 years of trying to get there, and when we finally got a fair voting system. Obviously, with that fair voting system came a very large constituency, in my case, the whole of Greater London, with 5 million voters, originally with 10 MEPs, now 8, because everyone's had to shuffle down. So, of course, one is remote. I mean, my previous experience of elected office was being ward councillor for, I think, 4,000 voters, and the contrast is extreme. But I would say to those who still lament that people don't know who their MEPs are, I'll come to the media later, I don't think a lot of people knew who their MEP was when you had single-member constituencies of 500,000 voters. So I don't buy that. Let me just, first of all, talk about the great positives. I mean, I hugely enjoyed being an MEP. I also believed that I was part of constructing a union which had a more chance of delivering the security and stability in the world, which is why I'm active on the Remain side now. But personally, the big striking, I think, factor being an MEP is you have a lot of responsibility as a backbencher. In fact, almost more than the chair of a committee, because you're responsible for an individual file. And just to take two that I worked on, something called the Visa Information System and the consular rules that went with it about how visas would be administered. I have to stress this is Schengen visas, because it's a Schengen project. And note that I suspect, I haven't really checked recently, but I don't think a British MEP would be rapporteur on a Schengen project now. I spent 15 years on the same committee, which is very boring of me, but is my passion in life, which is justice and home affairs. But obviously, when you have a regulation and the words are going to be directly applicable across all member states without being transposed into national law, you have a great responsibility for what you negotiate. And the other one I would mention is the data protection regulation, where I was unexpectedly made the shadow rapporteur, because obviously you've got a lead person and then all the other political groups have a so-called shadow. And I was that for the Liberal group. And perhaps particularly there, because within the European Parliament, the informal negotiations among MEPs are now all conducted in English with no interpretation present. So if you are an English native speaker, that does give you a little bit of an extra advantage, because people look to you to find the wording that will capture the state of the debate. So I can look at that regulation now and see some of my words in it as apply across 500 million consumers, which is quite powerful. And two things that I campaigned on. Unfortunately, I didn't get to put a question to Lord Howard. What was mentioned, he mentioned the Drinking Water Directive, but one of the panel earlier mentioned the Urban Wastewater Directive. That's the one which is about treatment of sewage before it gets, it's not a very nice subject, but before it gets expelled into the waterways. And we are now, we are awaiting the Thames super sewer, which Thames called Sarah's super sewer, or Sarah's tunnel, because I put a petition to the European Parliament, which requires the European Commission to respond, and the ultimate consequence of that was Commission enforcement proceedings against the UK for failure to implement the Urban Wastewater Directive, not only in London, but in London, probably because of the rain we've had this morning, regularly once a week you get discharges of raw sewage into the Thames, and the Thames super sewage is going to cost billions. Maybe we could have prevented that had the Urban Wastewater Directive not been resisted by the Tory government and failed to be implemented by the Labour government. It was 1991, we're now in 2016, and we are still awaiting the full treatment of sewage to clean up the Thames. So that was, you know, it was quite powerful, doing a petition that resulted in enforcement proceedings and the Thames super sewer. The other thing I campaigned on was rendition, UK complicity in rendition. I was vice chair of the sort of special committee set up to do that. We picked up where the Council of Europe had done extremely valuable work, but we put some pressure on, which is still, of course, not resolved, and the UK inquiry was suspended a few years ago, but what work we did in the UK must have had some effect, because it led to Jeff Hoon, then Defence Secretary, writing a letter of complaint about me to the European Parliament, about which I've always been proud. Then let me, I'm afraid, perhaps reflect on some of the things which weren't so good. There was variable quality of people in the administration. I would say generally the committee secretariats were good, But in the sort of bread and butter bits of the administration, you did have some very poor people and some people who were complete jobs worth, had to be done by the rule book with no imagination or sense of initiative. And now there is increasing amounts of parachutage, which used to be a commission disease, but under Martin Schulz, and there's been complaints recently, he wants to parachute all the people in his cabinet into the administration of the Parliament. I'd like to see staffing entirely on merit. Of course, it's logistically difficult to work across 3 offices, your constituency office, Brussels and Strasbourg. Strasbourg is a disgrace. Reduces our effectiveness by about 25%, I would say. And no one's been willing to put their head above the parapet and face up to the front of that, because there's always been more important things. Don't like the way things are stitched up by the big groups in European Parliament. I wouldn't have been so disappointed not to become chair of the Libe Committee in 2009 if the chap parachuted in by the Socialist group hadn't been the subject of huge complaints by the committee after. Whitehall and Ukrep pretty much ignored us in the European Parliament until we got full co-decision, which was late on Justice and Home Affairs. It wasn't until the Treaty of Lisbon we got full powers of co-decision, and then I was asked to do loads of talks in Whitehall among officials who didn't know anything about European Parliament. And lastly, the media, very poor. I have to say BBC, and I don't think Mark Mardell is maybe not here anymore, because I have to admit that that's what I mainly watch and listen. The BBC axed the one programme it had, The Record Europe, which was devoted to the European Parliament under the excellent Shireen Wheeler. It used to be on funny hours of the day and night, but at least it existed. And now we get, I think, one day a month in Andrew Neil's stewardship on the daily politics. And even now, I mean, you can see that in the referendum campaign, the BBC chooses Westminster MPs, largely male, of course, to talk about the campaign. Very few MEPs or ex-MEPs. And when they sent their political correspondence, their Europe correspondence to Brussels, of which Mark is the previous one, they were called Europe correspondents. They didn't have people devoted to the EU, and they were sent off to all the countries in Europe to look at, national things. And even when they were doing EU, they looked at the Council and the Commission. They really didn't come to the Parliament. So I think the BBC has served the public badly in terms of visibility of the European Parliament. So I enjoyed my years in the European Parliament. I hope I did a little bit of good in trying to advance justice and security, and it was what I always wanted to do, even when I got nominated to the House of Lords in '97. I said to Paddy Ashton, but I still want to get to the European Parliament. For another day, it's too boring to relate, but then I had to get disqualified from the House of Lords in 2009 to stand another term, and that was thanks to British officials, Julian Priestley, and the British lawyer who wrote a very creative legal opinion, which the UK government followed. So I have reason to be grateful to those people. Thank you.
Joining a multinational group, the Socialist group, you suddenly find yourself part of a larger political family. You're suddenly with politicians across borders. It's wildly exciting. You have no past history with these people, so you're coming at people completely new. No past prejudice, no animosity, although that might develop. But if you're open, it's one of the most wonderful intellectual, our friends from the Commission said this already, it's intellectually, it's absolutely amazing. 1 minute you are getting in a car with Otto von Habsburg. The next thing, you're turning around and you're talking to Mr. Stauffenberg, whose father tried to assassinate Hitler. The next minute you're turning around and there is Simon Weil, who survived Auschwitz. And I always remember the humbling experience of saying to a Spanish member of the far left group, what were you doing in such and such a year? And he said, en Castel. He was in prison under Franco. And if there's one feature of this campaign is leaving out the whole issue of what Brexit would mean for the rest of the European continent. It is breathtaking, and it's largely directed by a media who seems to be missing out. I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of British people who wish to discuss the dangerous populisms that are on the rise and that we could aggravate and possibly increase their support and lead to demands for referendums that could threaten the very future of the EU. But I wish we talked about it, and it really was humbling to talk to those who had been victims of totalitarian oppression of all kinds and just rejoiced in having become a member of a democratic family where the rule of law was so important, and the recognition and respect of human rights. One of the defining features of the European Parliament I found, and that largely came about through both positive action and proportional representation and a different culture when you look at Scandinavia, was that 35% of that parliament were women. And so that created an entirely different atmosphere. I remember one male colleague saying how much he enjoyed the more collegiate, practical atmosphere where things really got done. It was less sectarian, less adversarial, and areas around, and this is where I fundamentally disagree with our last speaker, you know, the social chapter. I went into the Parliament to secure pro rata rights for part-time workers. I went into the Parliament to secure better maternity and paternity leave. And above all, representing workers in Dagenham in a multinational company, Ford, I wanted those workers to have a say on European works councils that where multinationals could take decisions that would affect members across a large number of states. And that leads me very quickly on to becoming a spokesperson in the European Parliament for the car industry, which a position I held from 89 to 94. And there the Commission and commissioners, I think, enjoyed too much power, and to an extent today. And I said to Commissioner Bangerman, you know, it wasn't good enough having lunch with Agnelli and thinking you could create policy for the car industry. And I got together academics, car industry chiefs, trade union leaders and academics, VW, Renault, Ford, IG Metall, CGT, CFDT, and the T&G. And we all got together in a room and we had a discussion, amazingly collegiate, about the future of a car industry threatened with huge job losses, etc. And Jacques Delors, thank goodness, was president of the Commission. And I remember going to him and he's saying, what do you want out of this? And I said, well, I think it's not just cars, but textiles, a lot of other areas of the economy. We're faced with a lot of workers who are going to be made redundant as globalisation moves forward. And Jacques Delors said, OK, I'm going to talk to whomsoever. Out of it came Objective 5 of the European Social Fund, which was targeting training and provision for workers who would be faced with redundancy. And I'm very proud that that came out of that. Jumping momentarily, because Sarah made me think of it, press relations. I remember talking to Trevor Phillips at the time of these reports that I had authored on the car industry going through the Parliament. And I said, no coverage by ITN. And I said, if the European Parliament met in London, would you cover it? Oh, yes, he said. And that's what we've suffered from. We have Euronews, and we've continued in the Parliament to give great support to a very fine news organisation, giving an entirely different cross-cultural, cross-border perspective. I, like Sarah, remember appearing on programmes like L'Objectif Europe, a French weekly European programme, really no equivalent. And as Peter Pesson in The Observer this Sunday said, Europe's lacking that European media. I can tell you, not for want of trying to encourage a European dimension. Which leads me on to being on the Culture Committee, where with Jacques Lang, a very well-known French cultural minister, we led a charge to ensure that television legislation, which has to cross frontiers so that broadcasters can feel free to transmit in the satellite and cable and now internet age across frontiers. And I was one of the few Brits with a very well-known British filmmaker, Philip Whitehead, who worked with Norma Percy, responsible for some of the great documentaries of this country. And we tried, in the face of a lot of opposition from Mrs. T and the government, Reagan had lobbied against this, that more than 50% of European screens should be British European. And we lost a key vote, but still most channels do follow that dictum of more than 50%, and we hope to apply that to the online world. And even though you'll read horror stories in the FT that we're somehow imposing on Netflix 20%, they're already reached 23%, by the way, of UK European content. But that leads me on to answering a question in a previous section, which was how can we feel more European? That we watch ourselves more, and that means others in other countries. And I said to the Chief Executive of Channel 4 on Friday, thank you for Walter Presents. I was asking you to do that 20 years ago. Thank you for doing it now. But unfortunately, it is a little bit late because our young people have not seen Madrid, Modena, Bratislava, and other places in Europe on the screen. They have no image of the commonality that unites us. And in Erasmus and the Youth Civilian Services, we had a consensus in the European Parliament across all political groups that these cultural areas, the youth orchestra, the Baroque orchestra, jazz orchestra, EU Prize for Literature, these were all incredibly important issues of creating mutual understanding and partnership. Has there been one question, one part of any debate on any radio and television that has touched on the cultural side of this debate? Sadly not. But just to finish, we are considered sometimes an irritant. We have enormous influence. We would lose out from so many partnerships, exchange, cooperation. The rest of the world simply wouldn't understand if we left. We do have to bring more politics, education, culture to the UK. And an Italian colleague said to me yesterday, I want you to vote yes. But if you do vote yes and you do stay with us, could you try in the future just to love us a bit more than in the past?
Throughout the time that I was in the Parliament, I thought it was my role, and I think we all thought it was our role, was to change the position of the institution, to improve its position. And of all the institutions, there is not one that has changed as fundamentally as the Parliament in the last 35 years. But there's something else. All of those changes have come about in the face of almost total opposition from the British government of all colours. You can say people have been willing grudgingly to accept a slight movement here and there, but let's go back and have a look. Let's go back and have a look at the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty did never include the famous word co-decision, because the British government would not have the word co-decision inside the treaty. And it put in instead, according to the procedure laid down in Article 189A, or was it B? I forget. But the point was that there was a reluctance, and there is a continuing reluctance, an inability of the British political class to understand and to put the Parliament in a place which it feels comfortable with. So I am struck that even now we have a former Labour Foreign Secretary arguing that actually it was all a big mistake. We should never have had a directly elected Parliament. We should get rid of it. I would like to say that actually the Parliament is not just reached a point of stasis at the Lisbon Treaty, though people may say that. It's not true. I was one of the very few people in this country who argued strongly in favour of the Spitzenkandidaten process in 2014. Even got condemned because of a letter that I wrote to the Financial Times from probably people in this room, I don't know. All I can say is, if Britain stays in the European Union. One of the decisions it's going to have to take is, are its political parties going to participate in a process for selecting the next president of the European Commission, as we did in 2014? Because what you can't say as a sort of Remainer is that things will stay the same. They do not stay the same. There's an obligation to identify the direction that things are going in, and you can't wish the past away. 2014 happened, and it will happen again in 2019. The second thing I wanted to say something about, not relations with the government, was to say something about the relationships between us as officials and members of the European Parliament. It's very nice when you've spent most of your time in a committee to be told that the staff in the committee were actually decent people, and it was the problem with the people who weren't in the committees. Well, that, of course, makes me feel good. I have a slight glow. But what I would say is that, first of all, I would underline the point that it was the massive privilege for me to be able to work for people ranging from Le Pen's Front National to the Portuguese Communist Party. I found it the most stimulating thing. And if I were to say to anybody, why do you want to go and work in the Parliament? It is for that reason alone. I did not work particularly with British members. The two members on my right I have never worked with. And I never saw it as my job to look for the opportunity to work with British members, though I did work with some. However, what I think is quite important, and is again an ongoing argument, is the nature of the relationships between us and the members. I would not wish to name this person, but there is a member, a German member, sorry, I didn't mean to say that, a member from a country in the middle of Europe who would come into a committee secretariat and say, where's the socialist on the secretariat? I found this a quite appalling and shocking thing to do, and totally contrasted with my own experience of members of the European Parliament, one of whom, and he's a person that I like a lot, but he said to me, this book you've written, you and Richard Corbett and Francis Jacobs. Well, Richard, we know he's the Labour man, and Francis Jacobs, he stood for the SDP, didn't he, back in 1984, so I take it you're the Conservative then. I made it a position of mine never to reveal to any member of the Parliament where I stood politically. It was more than I did not want to do that. But I realise it's a different tradition, that we were in a Parliament of different traditions. Every single German, I'm sorry to keep taking the German example, but they're relatively important inside the Parliament at the moment. Every single German official has got either a black or a red label on them. Now, is that a better way of running things? I don't know. I can only say that actually, for those of us who are not associated, particularly with a particular party, we actually found it quite tricky. Because if I went to a member and would ask whether they might be able to help me, something which I actually hated to do, I did not like doing it, they would say to me, well, that's for the administration to decide. Isn't it? The result was that the chances, my career didn't go quite as far as it might have done under other circumstances. That said, I have no complaints about it. I only think, though, from a British perspective, it's really rather important to think about the kind of ways in which you want officials to relate to Parliament members. And it's not just a British view, actually, that they should not be so closely associated with the political position of the members. The last thing I wanted to say was something about the numbers. When we joined, Francis and I, back late 70s, early 80s, we British became quite numerous. There were virtually no committees of the Parliament in which there was not a British or Irish official. It was all to do with a very large expansion of the size of the Secretariat in the early 1980s. It's extraordinary to watch what's happened. We are now representing 12% of the population of the European Union in the Parliament, and the number of staff from the United Kingdom is now something like 5%. But if you think that's okay, let me tell you that if you do a forward projection of the retirement of the people who are in the Parliament and the rate at which we're recruiting more British staff, by the year 2050, there won't be a single British official left in the European Parliament, full stop. And I've seen the figures. I couldn't believe this was offered by EPSO themselves, or they didn't wish to show it out publicly. So why is this? Well, of course, we can come up with the usual things about, the press doesn't like us. Certainly Jeremy Paxman doesn't seem to like us a lot, I noticed the other week. But one thing that does strike me is when I hear the Prime Minister say, I don't love the institutions of Brussels. And that had a bit of a rang with me when I heard what Carol just said at the end about wanting us to love them a bit more. Funnily enough, I don't think it's anything to do with love. I don't love any institution, even the parish council in my own village, or Oxfordshire County Council, or the British Parliament. I don't love any of these things. But what I do is I respect them and consider them to be worthwhile. I would not have worked for the European Parliament for 31 years, I don't care how much you paid me, if I didn't think it was worthwhile and that it was an institution that merited the respect of the British political class, if I may put it that way. The day that I will feel happy about the relationship with Europe, and I suspect I'm not going to have it in my lifetime, is the day when the European Parliament is treated as a normal part of the way in which Britain governs itself. I don't want this book to be seen as the book written by a couple of eccentric former officials plus an even more eccentric member of the European Parliament with extraordinary views. I'd like the day when we turn round and say, well, actually, yeah, that's really useful as a way of understanding how we have decided to govern ourselves. I appeal for normality more than love. Thank you.
Interesting living in Ireland. What an amount of concern there is in Ireland about the debate going on at the moment in the UK. There hasn't been a day over the last 2 or 3 months when there hasn't been a Brexit conference of some kind or another, of all kinds, run by lots of different organisations. And there's concern about the economy, of course. The border question, which many people feel have been very casually brushed aside by many on the Leave campaign, because it's very hard to see if immigration becomes a key factor in a Brexit vote, how there wouldn't be huge pressure for a harder border of some kind. But the other concern in Ireland is also the fact that in spite of the historic differences, there's a lot of shared interests and values between the UK and Ireland within the European Union. Like others, I've greatly enjoyed the 37 years I've worked within the European Parliament. I think working together with different nationalities, has come across from all the speakers, has been hugely enjoyable. I think from a staff point of view, the informality of the European Parliament, I think Mike and I were very lucky to work with at a time when the European Parliament was changing its powers, and were able to be part of that process and to work probably closer together with MEPs, with politicians, than staffs in many national circumstances. I think we had a very informal and very fluid relation in committees with staff and members. And the third thing has also been mentioned by previous speakers, which is that so many of the people I've worked with among the politicians have had a very compelling story, which gives insights into why so many people feel the European Union, with all its defects, is so important. I've worked with people who were interned in concentration camps during the war. I remember seeing another Portuguese member who'd been interned by Salazar in the worst prison, and quite amazing to talk to him. And then thirdly, final example I'll give, was one of the really influential members of European Parliament, Altiero Spinelli, former commissioner, When he came to make a speech in the European Parliament, in the plenary, he would come out of the chamber and he would pace up and down, and he would always turn round exactly at the same place. And someone said, "Do you know why that is?" And I said, "No, that was the exact width of his prison cell for 7 years in one of Mussolini's prisons." So all those things are really compelling. I just wanted to make, I know I've got very little time, one just initial observation about changes in the British Party's attitudes to Europe during my time in the Parliament, and then a very, very brief reaction to 3 of the familiar claims made in the referendum. Firstly, that there's a majority in the EU for a United States of Europe. Secondly, that the EU is fundamentally undemocratic. And finally, that the UK is imposed upon within the EU. Very briefly on the flip-flop between Labour and Tory positions. When I started in the European Parliament, many people in the Labour Party, although it was divided, were very strongly against the EU, and some wanted the UK to leave. Conversely, I was on the Economic Committee at the time, whose chair was Jacques Delors, and the Conservatives in the Economic Committee were absolutely, they really respected and liked Jacques Delors, and they said, "What a pragmatic and good guy this is." And now look what's happened now with a complete flip-flop, where Labour has become in its vast majority broadly pro and pragmatically pro-European, and the Conservative Party is now the divided party on Europe. On the 3 claims made, first, the United States of Europe. The EU is such a difficult institution to explain because of the fact that it's much more than an intergovernmental body, but less than a federal state. And that makes it very hard to explain, especially the fact that it undoubtedly, in certain areas, has become much more powerful than it was when I started working in the European Parliament. But in terms of political will to create a, in inverted commas, European superstate, I can think of very, very few people, besides maybe in Luxembourg or in Belgium and a few others, who would strongly argue for that. I won't get into an argument of the definition of federalism, which was raised before. But still, I'm very struck by the contrast. When I started, the majority of my staff colleagues would have called themselves federalists and believed in a federal future for Europe. And now that's completely changed. There are obviously most people working for it believe in the institutions, but in a very pragmatic way, and wouldn't describe themselves very often as federalists. The other thing, of course, is the size of the EU budget. Hasn't been mentioned again this morning, but one thing which always strikes me is the fact that since I started working in the Parliament, the size of the EU budget hasn't grown. We've been fixated with this 1% of GDP. Compare that to a national budget. And I was given a copy of the McDougall report when I first joined the European Parliament, written for the European Union by the chief economist of the CBI, and he said, European Union the common market as it was then, is not developing in the direction of a United States of Europe for a long, long, long time at all, but there's a very compelling case for some kind of pre-federal budget at which the European community will be able to do much more than it can at present. I can't remember the figures he suggested, something like 3 or 4% of GDP, and yet we haven't grown at all in terms of budget. Second claim, the undemocratic EU. I won't go into that in detail, it's been covered by other speakers. The European Parliament has become a much more powerful parliament in many respects, not only on legislation, but on appointments to EU posts, where it has more power on appointments than any parliament in the world apart from the United States Congress. There are many other examples, but I won't go into them. Secondly, national parliaments. National parliaments have slowly got more powers than they did as a result of some recent treaties. What is needed, of course, is the resources and the will within the national parliaments to really make full use of those powers. And certainly the subsidiarity power is probably less important than the power for national parliaments to make contributions on EU legislation, which they are increasingly doing. And relations between the national parliaments and the European Parliament are sometimes difficult, but they've grown very greatly in recent years. The third thing, and the final thing I'll mention, that Brussels, quotes, imposes things on the poor UK. In practical terms, several people have pointed out some of the practical ways in which the whole environment of the European Union has been pretty favourable for the UK. The language shift, which so many people have mentioned, from French, which was the dominant language when I started and is now much, much weaker, and English is undoubtedly the dominant language. Secondly, the number of UK, within the European Parliament, the number of UK rapporteurs, coordinators, and so on, has been huge over the years, and there's been enormous influence of individual members. Two slight caveats in that, of course. One is the top job in the Parliament of being President has only been occupied by one British person, Sir Henry Plum, and now, of course, with the attitudes at the moment, it's less likely that there will be a British President at the moment. And having said that, put it into perspective, Italy, one of the founder members of the EU, has not had a President of the European Parliament since 1979 to the present. So UK is not unique. Certainly Spain and Germany have had more, but the UK, that can be exaggerated. The other thing, of course, is the decline in the number of staff. Now, the final point I wanted to make is on policy, where in policy terms, the influence of the UK, which has again been mentioned, I just wanted to emphasize 2 points. One, the UK agenda of widening rather than deepening, the importance and influence of the UK on enlargement. But secondly, the one with which I was much more closely associated, which was the single market. The British influence on the 1992 single market programme was enormous. Within the Economic Committee, it was British MEPs who, more than any other nationality, put the pressure on Jacques Delors and others to come up with the programme. The mutual recognition, to move away towards from harmonising everything to accepting mutual recognition of national standards, very much a British thing, which became very important. And more recently, the new emphasis on better regulation, impact assessment, and the implementation of what exists, not just creating new legislation, but better implementation of what is already there and seeing what's wrong with existing legislation. The British influence has been huge. I'll finish with one little anecdote, which is, it's an old one, but it's a very symbolic one. Even when something is in the UK interest, it's often denounced by the UK media. And the example I had in mind, because I was directly associated with it, was the proposal on lawnmower noise. And basically, to simplify a little bit, there were two major manufacturers of lawnmowers within the European community. One was German and one was British. The German government set a law which set the standard for lawnmower noise just above the level which was suited the German manufacturer but would have kept the British manufacturers' lawnmowers out of the German market. The British manufacturers protested to the Commission and said, this is not a consumer protection thing because the difference in noise is very little. This is pure protectionism. The Commission looked into it, said, you're right. They put forward a proposal, and who denounces it? The British media.
Sure.
So I just give that one little example, but just to emphasize again how the influence of the UK within the European Union over the years that I've been there has been very, very considerable. Thank you very much.